I'm going to briefly introduce the seminar before handing over to our three speakers. I think that the motivation for this particular seminar is our awareness that since the start of the health emergency just a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, many low-skilled migrants, or so-called low-skilled migrants, have suddenly become key workers in their host countries. They're now considered necessary and they're highly valued for their contribution to maintaining core state functions and public services such as healthcare, social care, food supply chains. We're very familiar with this. But what these developments do is raise very important questions about how we conceptualize and measure skills, and also how different types of migrants and other workers are valued in the labour market and in policy making. So that's going to be our focus this afternoon. We've got three speakers, but before I introduce them, I just wanted to, as a brief housekeeping note, we do want to make this an interactive seminar. So if you do have questions, unfortunately we can't, it'd be very difficult given the number of people we have to enable cameras and microphones. So could you write a question into the chat box? If you enable the function chat in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to send a message to Migration Policy Centre, and then we can field questions that way, which I think is what we, given our steep learning curve with this technology, is the way we think we can manage this. So if that's possible, to send questions that way. So I'm very pleased to welcome our three speakers this afternoon, two here in Florence and one joining us from Bristol in the UK. So in the order they will speak, we're going to hear first from Dr. Friedrich Poeschel, who is a visiting fellow at the Migration Policy Centre, and before that spent 6 years as an economist at the OECD. Friedrich is going to talk about the role of migrants in essential sectors. He'll speak for around 10 minutes on the role of migrants in essential sectors. We'll then hear from Professor Bridget Anderson, who's Professor of Migration, Mobilities and Citizenship, as well as the Director of the Migration Mobilities Institute at the University of Bristol. And Bridget's going to talk about how the current health crisis, or what the current health crisis means for how we think about skills and also about temporary migration. And finally, we're going to hear from Professor Martin Ruhs, who's Professor of Migration Studies at the European University Institute and Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Centre. And Martin is going to look at some of the implications for policy for implications for labour migration policy of current events. So as I say, 10 minutes each, and then we'll have time for Q&A. But as I mentioned before, if you could send questions via the chat function, then we can manage it that way, given the number of participants we have. So I'm very happy to hand over to Friedrich. So please, Friedrich, when you're ready.
Yes, good afternoon from my side. Let me start off this webinar with some empirical observations on migrants in essential sectors with a focus on Europe. So what are essential sectors to begin with? They are the sectors that are allowed to operate during lockdowns, and countries have come up with lists for these sectors. Here I've put together a little comparison of lists from 3 countries that are currently particularly affected by the pandemic: the United States, Italy, and Spain. And blue means that the sector is on the list, is allowed to operate. You see in this first section for agriculture and industry and construction, there's a lot of overlap. Of course, chemicals and pharmaceuticals are allowed, for example, medical equipment is allowed. But then you also see that in the United States, quite a bit more is allowed than in Italy and Spain, including in particular the entire construction sector. It's only allowed in the US, according to these lists, and related things like building materials production. If we go to the second part of the list, which is on infrastructure and services, there's again a lot of overlap. Financial services are allowed, media are allowed everywhere. But one can see that Spain is more restrictive on its list than Italy and the US. And the US overall, together with the first part, seems most permissive in allowing sectors to operate. So next I will concentrate on some sectors that, some broad sectors really, that appear on all 3 lists and that are indicated here on the left of the table: agriculture, energy supply, water and waste management, wholesale and retail trade, transport, and health and social work. And if you look at these sectors in a couple of European countries, you do find that migrants account for substantial shares of employment in these sectors. So here I'm just looking at non-citizen migrants. That means migrants who naturalized are not included in these numbers. It's something to keep in mind. For the whole EU 28, excluding Germany, because German data was not available in this context, you have around 6% migrants in employment in these essential sectors, but that is quite a bit higher in the countries I have selected here, which are traditional immigrant recipient countries, but at the same time currently quite affected by the pandemic. So you see that the share goes up to 18% in agriculture in Italy, and even 1/4 in agriculture in Spain. And in general, shares seem quite high in Austria and the UK, where it's between 10 and 14% in almost every essential sector. If we also included migrants who naturalized, then, for example, in France, the numbers would roughly double. These employment shares of migrants in these essential sectors have tended to grow over the preceding 5 years, especially in agriculture. And some OECD numbers for more detailed sectors also point to high increases in health, in residential care, and in logistics such as warehousing and support for transport. So these findings of substantial shares carry over if we look at the people who are currently most at the front line, so to speak, in the pandemic: doctors and nurses. These are numbers for 2017, not exactly migrants, but foreign trained health professionals. That is, these people came over as trained health professionals from abroad. And I have shown you here a couple of European countries first, where the percentages of foreign trained doctors and nurses vary, like around 5 and 10%. They get a lot higher when you come to the United States, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. In Switzerland, about 1/3 of all doctors are foreign trained, and 1/4 of all nurses. So what do we know, what can we say about the job situation of the migrants working in essential sectors? Here, this table is for the same broad sectors that I've selected before, and for the same 7 countries, but now all lumped together. First, in the first column, you can see that, yes, a considerable share of them is formally low educated, according to international standard classifications, except in health and social work, where it's only 14% who would be counted as low educated. Their earnings are in the majority below the median wage in the destination country where they live. And this refers to the net earnings that they have every month from their main job. Some of them are even in the lowest 10% of the wage distribution, which is the third column. Part-time work happens, but doesn't seem unusually high, let's say. Working unpaid overtime seems rare, very rare even, but working at night or working on Sundays happens quite frequently. One could imagine that this is, you would expect it in health or social work, but also in transport and wholesale and retail, it is quite frequent for these non-citizen migrants working in these essential sectors. Substantial shares of them have a fixed-term contract, especially in agriculture, where it's 63%, but only few have a contract with a temporary employment agency instead. Now, these numbers are by and large similar across the countries that are considered here, but there's some notable differences. For example, if you look at the share of low educated outside of health and social work, then you see that it varies between only 10 and 30% in Austria for these migrants in essential sectors, but it varies between 40 and 70% in Italy. And another difference is that contracts with temporary employment agencies are actually quite frequent in the UK, in France and the Netherlands, but are very rare elsewhere. And with that, I hand over to Professor Anderson.
So we've been asked to kind of think about the nature of skills and what we're learning from the current situation about particularly low-waged labour migration. And I think in the previous presentation, Friedrich demonstrated the importance of migrants, and notably defined as non-citizens in essential sectors. I just wanted to emphasise that we are talking about the top line, and most obviously we don't know about undocumented workers. So we know, for example, the Pew Centre's estimated that something like 30% of agricultural workers in the US are undocumented. And this was from a report that was published in November 2019, which estimated that there's about 3.9 to 4.8 million undocumented workers in Europe, mainly in the UK, Italy, Germany and France, and that they are concentrated in the sorts of sectors that Friedrich was talking about, so agriculture, cleaning and caring and so on. And also to point out that, you know, as we saw in the third of Friedrich's slides, or the fourth of Friedrich's slides, that actually when we burrow down into the detail of occupational data, we can see that migrants are often concentrated in very particular occupations. So what we see with social care, for example, in more micro-level studies, is that migrants are disproportionately likely to be working in direct care. So that's face-to-face cleaning, feeding, and intimate care. And this is just to cheer you up. Let's not forget the childcare workers and the teachers, as I think many people who are struggling with managing children and working from home are finding. So migrants or people might only count as key workers if they're looking after the children of key workers, but how long can we keep going by covering our childcare and our elder care domestically? So Martin and I have long been critical of the mechanisms for deciding whether a job is skilled or not, but I'm wondering whether the current crisis is suggesting that we have to go further and ask why the ways we have of valuing jobs and workers are so dependent on skill, however broadly we define this. So employers have gone through all sorts of contortions to explain why their workers are skilled, and I kind of feel like that's sometimes been mirrored academically. Certainly I've really sought to expand the notion of skill, but perhaps we should start to reflect on whether skill is an adequate measure of the value of people's work. So maybe as well as rethinking skills, as the title of the webinar suggests, maybe we should be thinking in terms of whether we should be thinking in terms of skills at all, because we've discovered that the people that we depend on are actually people like hospital cleaners and shelf stackers and drivers and so on. And of course, as Friedrich has demonstrated, many of them are migrants, variously defined. And I think it's worth noting that for some of the better paid and qualified jobs, like pharmacists or nurses, which are still counted as low skilled and low waged in many countries, there are visas available. But for others, there aren't visas because they're considered low skilled. So the migrants who are working in them are on a range of visas. They might be on spouse visas or cultural exchange type, or just or permanent residents who are working. So I think this is maybe a distinction that it is worth us thinking a bit more about, that not all migrants who work are on migrant worker visas. So I suppose that's 2 points to think about. Firstly, not all migrants who work are on migrant worker visas, but also that many of the jobs on which we depend are also key jobs and they're not necessarily skilled. So what does this mean for how we think about labour demand and migration? Now, one of the perceived advantages of migrant labour on migrant worker visas is that migrants are relatively easy to hire and fire, and time is an important factor in demand and supply of migrant workers, especially those that enter on temporary programs. But again, I think what has been exposed is the assumed resilience in supply chains, in labour supply chains, but that these labour supply chains are not as resilient as imagined. And the obvious example is seasonal agricultural workers, because we can see how producers in many countries, from Canada and the EU and the US, there is concern about labour shortages for seasonal agricultural workers. So I think COVID has explained the taken for granted access to, in this case, seasonal migrant labour with its flexibility. But it relies not just on them wanting to come, but on international transport infrastructure and sending states permitting their citizens to move. So there's a big shortage in Spain at the moment, but that began on the 13th of March because Morocco stopped people from moving, stopped people from going to Huelva to pick fruit. And notably, the government, I saw a couple of days ago, is about to issue a decree that authorises, among other things, asylum seekers who previously had no permission to work to take up work in the agricultural sector. So they're making use of migrants who are in the country, not on migrant worker visas. I just want to say that I think there are important ways also of connecting this to even broader questions which are related to the nature of COVID itself and its connection to global big agriculture, and recommend the work of Rob Wallace on this. It's really interesting stuff. Analysis of migrant labour demand. Again, Martin and I have talked a lot about system effects, and I wonder whether we need to be joining this up with different kinds of network effects. So one alternative to employing migrant labour has always been offshoring, but offshoring can reduce supply chain resilience, as we're seeing with the big debacle about surgical masks in the US, or to go back to the Spanish strawberry pickers in Huelva, the UK government might say there's no need to have strawberry sector in the UK, but that doesn't mean that British consumers are not dependent on low-wage migrant labour, but rather that they're dependent on low-wage migrant labour in Spain, and the UK government has no levers of control over supply. So finally, just to flag that we need to think about the public health risks of reduced migrant workers' rights, because at the same time as being key to socioeconomic life, we're seeing how migrants are marginalised in response to the crisis. But rather than talk about this at length, I will pass over to Martin.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I will complete the set of presentation by offering a few reflections on what the light that we now are shining on migrants' contributions, and especially their skills, and what that might mean for how we think about labor immigration policy. And I suppose one of the questions I'm asking myself is, what's new about these debates that we are having now, and how might that challenge our status quo thinking about how we regulate labor immigration and how we think about migrants' contributions and their role in the economy. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes summarizing what is very well known, but I think it's important to just go over what is the status quo in labor immigration policymaking, and how do we generally think about skills and impacts according to the conventional wisdom. And this will be known to many people who are watching, that the great majority of labor immigration programs around the world are temporary migration programs. So that means that they provide temporary residence and work permits on arrival. Some of them allow migrants to upgrade to permanent residence after some time, but on arrival, the vast majority of labor immigration programs are temporary migration programs. The few permanent migration programs, so those programs that give permanent residence on arrival, are really limited to highly skilled workers. So there's a differentiation there. In general, labor migration policies around the world are much more open to more highly skilled labor migrants, and they provide more highly skilled labor migrants more rights. It's actually more precise to say that they provide more rights to people who enter under programs that target highly skilled workers, because as we know, there's often a mismatch between the skills that people have and the kinds of programs that they're admitted under. The point I'm trying to make is that, as is well known, there's this differentiation in labor migration policy by skill level. And why is it that most policies are more open to the more highly skilled and give more highly skilled migrants more rights? Well, I think it's based on this common idea that more highly skilled migrant workers tend to create greater net benefits for the host country. In general, most labor migration policies are based on some sort of cost-benefit assessment, what's in it for the host country, and we know from economic research that the fiscal effects of more higher skilled and higher paid workers tend to be more positive in net terms than those of lower paid workers. Of course, that's true for natives as well, not only for migrants. If you're concerned about the labor market effects of immigration, we know that on average, these effects are not large, but maybe where they exist, they tend to be concentrated at the lower end of the income distribution. So if you're worried about distribution and equality, maybe that is part of the case for more highly skilled workers. And of course, countries are worried about economic growth, accumulation of human capital, how can we maximize productivity growth? So these are all the types of reasons that many countries use to justify being much more open to more highly skilled workers. And a good example of that is, for those of you who have been following debates in the UK, as the UK leaves the European Union, there's a big debate about how labor migration will be organized in the future. And a new paper has just recently come out that makes few proposals. And the kinds of thinking and the kinds of mechanisms that I've just talked about are very visible in this paper. So the paper advocates a points-based system that really privileges more highly skilled workers for precisely the reasons that I've just mentioned. Now, of course, we do know that there are also shortages in lower skilled sectors, and many high-income countries do admit workers, migrant workers, also into those sectors. But as Bridget mentioned, we for a long time have had big debates about how to link labor migration to the alleged needs of domestic labor markets and economies. So there's been one big debate: how do you measure skills? What is a skill? Some skills are credentialized, you can measure them by certificates. Others are much softer skills, team working skills, people skills that are much harder to measure. So how do you actually decide what is a skilled job? What's a shortage? Economists like to think that shortages are in general partly dependent on wages. So in the most simple model of the labor market, if there's a shortage, wages should go up. Now, there might be reasons why wages might not go up in practice, but the point here is that a shortage is actually quite a contested concept, and there's a big debate about how you measure them. And finally, also, we've had debates for a long time whether or not, if there is a shortage, whether or not immigration is the first best response, or should it perhaps be trying to have higher wages to attract more domestic workers? Should it be some sort of automation, or should it even be thinking about whether a particular product should be produced at all in a country? I'm thinking about certain agricultural products. So these debates have been going on for a long time. What does it mean to be skilled? What's a shortage? And is it a good idea to use immigration? There's a lot of research about these issues. And we also know, and that's the last general point I'm going to make before I return to COVID, we also know that in practice, the demand for migrant labor in particular sectors is the result of what Bridget and I have in the past called system effects. So the reason why there's demand for migrant workers often has to do with issues that are separate from immigration. For example, because there isn't a good training system for domestic workers. Or for example, there aren't the proper housing policies that allow citizens to live near where the work is. A good example is, for example, social care in the UK. where there's a very high demand, very high share of migrants in the UK. Why is that the case? Well, everybody agrees that a primary reason is low pay in the sector. Why are wages so low? Because it's publicly funded, and there has been chronic underinvestment in the social care sector. So that is really the reason that drives the demand for low-wage workers and therefore also migrant workers. So I'm mentioning this because these debates about what are skills, what are shortages, and why do we have immigration, why do we rely on immigration in particular sectors, have been going on for a long time. So what's new in a way? What does COVID-19 change? Well, I think one thing that's new, and Bridget has alluded to this, is that it makes us perhaps rethink some of the policy goals when we conduct labor immigration policy. So most countries, I think, broadly think about how labor immigration can benefit the economy, and maybe they're also worried about distributional effects. But of course, public health now is another important issue that we're all thinking about these days. And the idea that we need migrants to support core state functions and public services. So what does that mean for labor immigration policy? Another question is, should we have strategic labor immigration policies or strategic policies that support these essential sectors to make them more resilient? I think many people would agree, but of course these policies would need to be general policies, not only about immigration, but for example also about strengthening employment conditions in these sectors. I think another question when it comes to labor immigration is, are the implications primarily for how we think about the admission of workers or about the rights of people who are already here? So again, as Friedrich and Bridget also highlighted, many of those essential workers who are migrants work under quite precarious conditions, partly or sometimes because they're on temporary work permits. So is what is happening now an argument for maybe paying much more attention to the employment conditions and protections for migrants on temporary work permits in lower skilled jobs? There's a question of whether, for example, points-based systems should give extra points for key workers when they think about admitting migrants. Should migrants in those essential sectors maybe be given faster access to permanent residence? I think these are all the kinds of questions that arise now. My last slide presents a few questions that are offered in the spirit of some healthy skepticism in terms of what are the challenges when we think about these things. Well, obviously, if we pay much more attention to essential sectors and key workers in labor immigration policymakers, the first question immediately is, well, which are these sectors and what are these occupations? And of course, there's going to be heavy employer lobbying to have their jobs be put on this list so they can get good access to migrant workers. So I think there's a comparison to debates in industrial policy in terms of identifying these sectors. How do we define resilience, and how can we measure when resilience is achieved, and what does that mean really for the role of migrants in these sectors? So I will leave it at that. And again, the idea of today's presentations was not to present any answers, but really to present reflections and raise some of these fundamental questions that we think are important to think about. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks also to Friedrich and to Bridget for their presentations. We've got some questions that have come in, and I'll have to put them to you on behalf of the people who asked them, so hopefully I will do them justice. That I will direct them to the person who I think might be best placed to address them. First of all, I think to Bridget, we have questions from Marianella Barrios and from Federica Bicchi, who are wondering about adding the layer of gender to the analysis to see what the implications may be for ideas about skill and implications for workers themselves. Perhaps for Martin, we have a question from Diana Fau, who has, I hope I'm pronouncing people's names correctly, many apologies if I'm not. But Diana is asking about whether we need more legal force, amending laws which pay migrants appropriately. So asking about levels of remuneration, legal frameworks for that. And Diana also asked about a country like Finland. Maybe this could go to Martin as well, which does give the chance to asylum seekers that wish to work a work permit to enable them to contribute to asylum seekers. So is it time to help the integration of asylum seekers on the employment market and social integration of refugees and asylum seekers? So that was a question from Diana. For Friedrich, we have a question from Sandra King-Savage, who asks about the situation, particularly about his situation in Switzerland for foreign trained people. And she asks Friedrich, Sandra is asking Friedrich, if there's some background information on where these people come from, apart from Germany, in Switzerland. And finally, we have a question from Valentina Flögel, and she's asking about the framing of these issues. And I think maybe also for Bridget, this question, is it an issue in which a framing of migration as an economic asset is simply because migrants are more willing to work for a low wage? And Valentina also asks if it's better to begin to frame low-skilled as essential, since many high-skilled, so-called high-skilled desired migrants are not necessarily essential at all. So many thanks for those questions. We've got some more questions have arrived, but if we could go in the order you spoke, so Friedrich, then Bridget, then Martin, and if we could be relatively brief, please, because more questions are waiting. Thank you. So Friedrich.
Yes, thanks. I'll be quite brief. To be honest, I don't know off the top of my head where they come from in Switzerland. It's obviously that Germany is responsible for a large number there. I would guess Austria too, because of the language advantage. But otherwise, one can look it up. It's online, the OECD Health Workforce Migration Database has, so if you Google that, OECD Health Workforce Migration Database, then you find online tables also by country of birth, or country of training at least, for doctors and nurses.
Thank you, Friedrich. Bridget? You need to unmute.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so good question on gender, because actually part of what I've been thinking kind of while I've been sort of looking at this is, wow, this is just what feminists have been saying for a long time, which is that actually we need to be starting from a position that values care and reproduction, understood in the broadest sense of the word, and valuing that, and that actually skill is in itself a highly gendered concept, that actually, you know, the origins of skill and specialization lie in distinctions which are to do with household work, and to do with distinctions that rest on both slavery and gender. And in terms of the framing, again, I think that's a really important question. I mean, one could say, you know, why should wealthy countries be able to take advantage of the kind of gross global inequality that means that some people are having to work for lower wages than others? And I certainly think that thinking about essential workers rather than in questions of skill is a good way forward. And just finally, in relation to that, I wonder whether we need to be also thinking more broadly than, or framing this more broadly than labour migration, as I say, because I think many people are not on worker visas.
Thank you, Bridget. Martin?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. So in response to the first one about, if I understood correctly, enforcement of employment conditions, well, I think this is absolutely critical, and I suppose it's one response that many people will have in mind. I mean, if we're thinking, how can we make some of these sectors and some of this work more resilient, then surely we would want to make sure that people doing this work operate under acceptable employment conditions. They're not in precarious work. And that, of course, applies to citizens as well as migrants. Now, we know that migrants who work in some of these sectors often face additional vulnerability precisely because of their status as migrants, especially new migrants. If they're on work permits, their rights are restricted in many ways, which is why I think it is important to think about whether or not we should really rethink temporary migration programs for low-skilled, for what is generally called low-skilled work, in terms of the rights that are attached to these programs. I think the one issue that I'm concerned about is that we do know, of course, that many migrants currently work in low-skilled, lower-paid jobs, and they're being, in one way or another, exploited. We can have a discussion about what exploitation means, but I think we have to be careful that when we shine a light on the role of migrants in these sectors, and then we make the case there's a demand for these migrants, that we don't institute current conditions. We don't further entrench current conditions, which is precisely why I think the raising of employment standards is a real key response. And briefly in response to the second question, I think, yes, work permits for asylum seekers and refugees. I think certainly in terms of refugees, a lot of countries are thinking about how they can have refugees contribute, how they can think about the currently rigid accreditation systems that exist in many countries. And to some extent, maybe this debate also applies to asylum seekers, even though when it comes to asylum seekers, there's a bigger debate about the difficulties that might arise when you mix asylum seeking with labor immigration. I think there's a good case that this can be done under certain circumstances, but I think there's some broader issues to consider as well.
Great, thank you, Martin. So we've got more questions coming in. I'm going to try and do justice to them and direct them to the person who I think is can deal with them. First, we have a question from David Jepson, and I'll ask Friedrich to address this one. He asks about political as well as economic drivers behind the in relation to migration policy, and will COVID-19 change some of these? So that our ideas about about skill change as a result of COVID-19, and one effect of this may be to change our understanding of skill. Luca Lixi asks a question which I think can go to Bridget. Some suggest that due to the current crisis and shortages, employers will start thinking more seriously about automation. And do you think that in sectors we are talking about, like agriculture, employers will have the means to make considerable investments and move towards more automation, given how squeezed they are by, as we already know, by big companies buying the produce of agricultural producers? So a question there from Luca Lixi. We have a question from Agnese Lace, or Lace. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your second name, which maybe could ask to Martin. About solutions for access to healthcare. Is the current regulation of mandatory health insurance insufficient? And can access to healthcare be solved without causing public backlash? So that's a question from Agnese. We have a question from Richa, and he asks, or she asks, about the brain drain in countries like India and Philippines to fill shortages in advanced countries, especially in the light of challenges of COVID-19 that those challenges impose on developing countries. Perhaps Friedrich could address that question. Then we have a question from Helen Dempster, one of the alumni of our summer school last year, so nice to connect with Helen. And maybe a question here which could be for Martin. How do you feel the COVID-19 crisis will affect public support for more migration? Either the increased recognition of a role of migrant workers in our economies leading to more migration, more support for migration overall, or an increase in perhaps in xenophobia, racism, coupled with misguided attempts to free up jobs for the newly unemployed, which gives political leaders the ammunition they need to keep borders closed and decrease migration. So that's an issue posed by Helen. And then finally, we also another one which is directly for Martin, from Johnny Runge in the National Institute for Economic and Social Research in the UK. He asks about one of Martin's final points, the potential difficulty of defining key workers. And Johnny is asking that he says that it seems there's danger that we will go on to define essential sectors, key workers, in terms of the previous crisis, like the current pandemic, rather than the future. And finally, a question from Olena, which I'll pose to Bridget. And she asks, what do you think is the role of temporary work agencies these days in terms of channeling mobility, and what should be their responsibility towards protecting mobile people? So those are fantastic questions. We could probably have seminars about all of them, but if you could please keep your answers brief because we have more questions coming in. So begin with you, please, Friedrich.
Yes, indeed. Interesting questions. It's hard to keep it short. Well, about the how COVID-19 pandemic might change our view of skills and yeah, the drivers behind it. Say the example of seasonal migrants, I think, is an informative one, because seasonal migrants are thought of as kind of, you know, yeah, anybody could do the job. You don't need anything particular to do this. And so, for example, in Germany, they just 2 weeks ago, or 1 week ago, they closed borders also to Romanian seasonal workers, which are actually quite important to keep the food supply chain going. And the first idea coming from politicians was, yeah, well, we can have volunteers doing this, or we can ask recent asylum seekers to do this. And I think behind the scenes, they were quite quickly told by farmers, this is not at all the same thing. If we have people coming who come every year, who know how to do the job, who are reliable, that is a very different thing than having new people on the field where we don't know how long they last, etc. So, because this is quite tough work. So I think in this case, even though it is considered a very unskilled kind of occupation or kind of activity, there's a new appreciation of, like, yeah, you have to be able to do the work, you have to have some experience with it, and that might change our view of what skills are, and also, you know, highlight how useful it is to have, for example, seasonal migrants on a regular basis. The second question about challenges from brain drain. Yes, I mean, especially in terms of some sectors where there is a, say, perhaps even global shortage of people who can do it. Think about the health sector or social care. Then yes, taking foreign trained health professionals away from origin countries cannot have a good effect on them, and has often a very bad effect on them. Firstly, to a certain extent, there's not much one can do. One cannot tell a trained doctor, say in Angola, to Angola might not be a good example, but take any country to just stay there because that is in the interest of your country. I think it's various policies that have been proposed there to sort of tax them or don't really work. One has to, of course, improve their working conditions. But perhaps a better approach is to think more about triple win programs. So when you have an immigration, say, of health professionals, that you make sure at the same time that in the origin country, there's an education system going on that produces more than you take yourself via immigration, so that the origin country also benefits from having this education system in place and can keep a fair share of these trained professionals for themselves.
Hello. Hi. So yeah, I'm not sure I'm particularly well qualified to answer these questions, but I'll do my best. So on automation, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I suppose I would respond by saying, firstly, that I do think we have to be cautious about a sort of techno-determinism. I'm not suggesting the questioner was saying that. In fact, I think what the questioner was pointing out was the importance of political and economic context in shaping demand for automation. So that is something that obviously there are technical questions about, you know, whether a certain industry is also is possible to automate. There are also social questions. So some countries, there might be much more acceptable to automate care tasks, for example, than others. and so there are technical questions, there are also political questions. But I wouldn't say that automation necessarily eliminates demand for so-called migrant low-wage labour, because often automation can in fact mean that rather than having people who have some kind of level of skills to do a job, you need one person to kind of press a button mechanically, and that person might be more likely to be a migrant than the kind of people involved in semi-skilled work. So so I think it kind of, the question about automation, I think, sort of opens up lots of other issues. Then in terms of temporary work agencies, yes, temporary work agencies, there definitely needs to be more oversight and more responsibility. But I think we also need to get back to some basics and think about when and where and why are temporary work agencies needed. Are there better ways of organising labour supply than involving private profit-making agencies?
Thank you, Bridget. Martin?
Thank you. Yeah, in response to the first question about providing access to healthcare, well, I think this is really quite a critical issue, and it's an example of a right or of an access for migrants that's actually very much in the interest of the host country's population. And I think we basically need a much more stronger public narrative that also explains that. I mean, different countries have different health systems. You have universal systems in some countries, insurance-based systems in others. But whatever the system is, I think what COVID-19 does is highlight the fundamental importance of making sure migrants have equal access to it, certainly in terms of primary care and emergency care. So this idea that giving migrants rights, even those who are newcomers, is absolutely fundamental, not only for migrants themselves, but also for the rest of us, also partly to maintain these key and essential services. I think that's really important. So I think it partly goes to this argument, how do we frame the contributions of migrants? And how do we explain that in a way that they go beyond the immediate economic contributions that we've been talking about so far? So I would give a similar answer in terms of the question on what's the impact of COVID on attitudes. I mean, we know attitudes to immigration are determined by a range of things, but one factor that's often quite important is the perceived contribution or the perceived deservingness of migrants. And again, people tend to think about it in narrow economic terms, and people don't know that some of the numbers that Friedrich showed, some of the high shares of migrants in public sector occupations. I mean, the contributions that migrants make to the public sector is not widely appreciated. So I think, again, having a political discourse and having leadership that points out that migrants don't only work for private companies, but actually help provide some of these essential and public services, I think that could go a long way to ensuring that there might be a positive impact on attitudes. And finally, the question, who are the key workers? Well, yes, I mean, that's as I said in my presentation, I think it's an important question. And then not everybody, if we have a list of key workers, not everybody can be a key worker. But I think the answer depends on again, how we frame the issues. So key work with regard to what exactly? And I come back to this issue that we know that a lot of employers are making all kinds of arguments for better access to migrant workers. And a lot of employers will say that all their workers are skilled and all their sectors are very important and they're all key sectors. So I think the political challenge also is to kind of have some indicators, some criteria which you can use to actually identify these essential sectors and these key workers.
Great, thank you, Martin. So we're going to have a final round now. I'm going to try and put together quite a lot of questions, so everybody be ready, have a pen ready while I go through these. We also have some observations as well. I'll begin with an observation from Kirsi from Finland, who is informing us about how government officials and employment agencies in Finland are now tackling staff shortages in agriculture by checking if work permit requirements can be relaxed. So thanks for that from Kirsi. We then have a question from Matthias Meyer, which I will put to Friedrich, who asks, Matthias asks whether in a hard corona-induced economic recession with high domestic unemployment in EU member states, will there still be the need for economic migration for cushion to labour to cushion labour shortages. Matthias hypothesizes that yes, there will in certain sectors such as health and ICT. Then we have a question, again, I'm going on user ID, so H. Minishi. So I don't know the first name there, but the question is, which I will put to Martin, is the interlinkages between labour migration policies that emphasise the ability of migrants to be self-reliant in the host country by providing settlement funds or cap wages in prioritising skilled workers over low-skilled workers. What are the interlinkages, therefore, between labour migration policies and these kind of settlement funds or cap wages in prioritising skilled workers over low-skilled workers? We have somebody who's corresponding from the Lettori Interculturali and asking about migration in Morocco. And I would say in relation to that, they're very interested in that question. Well, watch this space, because in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a seminar, our next webinar, sorry, which will focus on this question. It's not one we can address today, but in 2 weeks' time, we'll have a seminar in migration in Morocco and implications maybe for the Spanish enclaves in Morocco. So we hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. A question perhaps for Bridget, and this is from 39320. So that's all the information I have. But from 39320, should we expect an even more negative impact on rural areas compared to urban areas by the lack of migrant labour force due to COVID-19? Then we have a question from Maria Elena, who would like to ask whether hosting communities, and perhaps also for Bridget this question, whether hosting communities, specifically those dealing with refugee flows, should focus more on soft skills along with language courses in order to facilitate integration into their new environment. A question from Tiziana Caponio, one of our colleagues at MPC, so hello to Tiziana. Tiziana, maybe this question for Friedrich. The health crisis has pointed out the limits of firms' relocation policies to China, which in Italy were not only essentially a substitute for the recruitment of unskilled workers in the manufacturing sector. And Tiziana is wondering if we see a broader impact of the reduction of relocation strategies on migrant recruitment policies, and more generally on the definition of the relationship between skills and labour shortages. That's a question from Tiziana. Maybe Friedrich could address that one. And then a question from Maria Elena Costa. That's all I'm seeing. So I'm not really sure what the full name is. But the question is, we see that people are eager in finding a job and it's very essential to them. But perhaps there's a question for Martin. Maria Elena thinks puts the question of whether it's difficult to integrate new migrants into host communities. Perhaps a question then maybe for Martin, from Othman Yassin. How can reform the common European asylum system and create legal ways to arrive in Europe without endangering life? And then a final question. I'm afraid there are more people who have come in, but I'm afraid we just haven't got time today to deal with all of the questions. I'm very sorry. A final question which came from Babacar, perhaps to Bridget, and Babacar talks about the way in which COVID-19 has shown the importance of low-skilled workers in low-skilled employment. And Babacar is wondering whether you think this can push policymakers to rethink labour migration policies, whether perhaps policymakers, do you think, will be more receptive? We do have more questions, but I'm really sorry, we're just not going to have time to deal with them today. But we do have questions. We may be able to get back to you and share information about some of the issues. So I'm sorry, but time is running out. So if you could be quite short in your responses, I know the questions are fantastic, but if you could be relatively short in your responses, perhaps again start with Friedrich.
Yes, thanks again for the questions. To start off with the question, is there still a need for labor migration in recession? I would agree with Matthias, who raised the question that yes, there will be a need for certain highly skilled migrants in any case, like IT professionals, because these occupations will keep growing. And the second observation is that what we've seen before in similar recessions of large scales is that migrants respond to it by moving a lot. They are much more mobile than native born, and so they are more prepared to go where the jobs are. And if a country is in a recession and unemployment is high, they are more likely to leave. So this is something that we would see anyway in response to, so in that sense, labor migration will go down from this reaction anyway. But a third point I would like to make is it is a widely spread naive idea that somehow when there's unemployment, then the native born will sort of take over jobs that migrants vacate, or that where labor migrants do not come in anymore to take these jobs. I don't think that happens at a really large scale, because as I've pointed out in my presentation, these jobs involve things like Sunday work and work at night, and native born who lost their job but still have unemployment insurance and so on. They get on for a while. I don't see many of them suddenly getting ready to do jobs with conditions that they're really not used to. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of substitution there. And the other question about what will this mean for relocation, skills and labor shortages, yeah, that's a very wide-ranging question. I refrain from making, say, bold predictions here, but what this crisis highlights is that, yeah, the global interdependencies are vulnerable, or make supply chains also vulnerable, and the general tendency, the general reaction to this will be, I guess, to be more risk averse when you plan your supply chain, and to value again if you have things locally. So there would be, I guess, a new emphasis on producing things domestically, or in a place where you think nothing can happen to the supply chain, and that sort of will reinforce a trend that's already there from rising wages in the countries where a lot of relocation was moved to. So there's going to be, I won't say economic nationalism, but there's going to be a tendency to be more inward looking in economic terms.
Thank you, Friedrich. Bridget?
Yeah, so on the rural-urban question, I don't know, but I would take the question as an opportunity to point out that yes, in many parts of the many parts of the world, including in Europe, there is a kind of emptying out of rural areas with a lot of consequences, and that should make us think about the connections between internal movement and demand for migrant labour. So we tend to kind of separate out, or to think that people moving from a rural area to a city in wealthy countries, we don't associate that with migration. But I think that definitely needs to be put into the mix. On the soft skills and integration, I think that there is maybe one of the things that we've learned is actually that migrants are very well integrated, certainly in terms of the labour market, and that very often the labour market and engagement in the labour market is represented as, the route to integration. Well, hey, it turns out that there's a lot of people that are very well integrated, and yet they're still not necessarily treated with respect or socially integrated. So that, I think, maybe suggests that the onus is more on the us of the host so-called populations than it is on the migrants. And finally, on whether there's going to be a kind of pushback on labour migration policies, I mean, I think that so Milton Friedman said, in times of crisis, we have huge changes and make use of the ideas that are lying around. So I think the question is, what are the ideas that are lying around? And now it's true that it's been shown that many low status work is key work. But I wonder whether, but I think what will happen with that will depend in part on what trade unions and migrants organisations do. And more particularly, I'm wondering whether there is going to be more of a push immediately for regularisations rather than a change in admission policies.
Thank you, Bridget. Martin?
Yes, if I've understood correctly, on the question of labour migration and settlement, so that means kind of permanent residents, migrants staying permanently. I mean, as I suggested, one idea might be to say that if we value particular sectors and occupations very much, and if we appreciate migrants' work in those sectors, you could speed up migrants' access to settlement. I mean, something like this, I understand, has actually been done in some countries. For example, in Canada, under the Living Caregiver program in the past, after I think it was 2 years, people could actually get access to permanent residence. So this was unusual, and this was a fast tracking, but it was partly a recognition of the type of work that was being done. So it was in appreciation of the particular type of work that was being done. It should be said, however, that one reason why we have so many temporary migration programs is precisely because many countries have an interest in limiting migrants' work to particular sectors. And you know, while a nurse or a doctor might remain in that occupation after they settle and get full rights, one thing that a lot of countries are concerned about is that if you have the shortages in these low-wage sectors, once migrants become settled, they might leave those sectors and not do this work anymore. On the one hand, you might say that's just fair enough because they deserve that, they have contributed. But what does that mean then to shortages in those sectors? So I think it's quite a difficult debate. How do you make sure that this work gets done? And what questions does this raise in turn about why employment conditions are so poor in many of these essential sectors? So shouldn't the response or the first response rather be increase employment conditions rather than immediately think about more immigration in those sectors? In terms of the legal pathways, the last question, I do think that the COVID crisis might emphasize or re-energize debates about more legal pathways. Of course, this is a very long-standing debate. Should there be more legal pathways especially for employment in lower wage jobs? And I think what we see now is that many migrants doing these jobs might not be in regular situations. So there's an interest in regularizing their situation, as Bridget suggested. But there's also an interest in offering legal ways of admitting more workers for doing these jobs. I think the old debates are still going to be there. Why are these jobs, again, the way they are? Do we really need migrants, or do we just need to change the way these jobs are done? If you look at Friedrich's data, again, you see the role of migrants in the same sectors varies quite a lot across different countries. So there isn't only one way of organizing work in particular sectors. So I think it remains to be seen what happens with the impact of the crisis on the debate about legal pathways. But I do think there is a chance that people will think again about whether or not more pathways are needed for doing particular types of jobs, especially in those essential occupations.
Thanks, Martin. I think we've run out of time. I'd like to thank everybody for participating, the speakers, and also the really great questions, and also apologise to those questions we just weren't able to get to. But hopefully you'll be able to join us for future seminars and be able to join the discussion there. So apologise for that. So it's great to be in touch. We know we're living in difficult times, and so for everybody, we hope you stay safe and stay well. And we will be doing more webinars. So in 2 weeks' time, there will be a further webinar, which is following on from some of the themes developed in this session to look at migrant workers in some particular sectors, particularly in agricultural employment. We'll be sharing information about that very soon, so keep an eye on all the communication channels from the Migration Policy Centre, and so we look forward to being in touch with you again in the future. So many thanks, and we'll hopefully see you again soon. Bye.